Well, hello, and welcome to Ian Wygath Tuesdays with the Pilgrims Halloween special. Today we're going to read a fun ghost story for all ages, but we're reading the abridged version because I am sure you have better things to do with your time today, including answering the door to all kinds of interesting princesses, Jedi warriors, ghosts, goblins, witches, and other things that will come seeking gifts from you. Give the gift lest you suffer the trick. Today we're going to read an abridged version of Oscar Wilde's The Canterville Ghost. Chapter 1, Canterville Castle. Mr. Otis looked at the castle with delight. "I'll buy it," he cried. "Excellent," replied his guide, Lord Canterville. "But perhaps I should warn you, Canterville Castle is haunted. My family had to move out many years ago after my great-aunt had a dreadful experience." Mr. Otis wasn't worried. He didn't believe in ghosts. A week later, Mr. and Mrs. Otis arrived with their children, Washington, Virginia, and the twins. They were greeted by an old woman who was neatly dressed in a white apron and cap. "I'm Mrs. Humphrey," she said. "Come inside. There's tea for you in the library." "Cake!" shouted the twins, diving in. Virginia wasn't interested in the food. She had spotted a poem in the library upon the window. Before she could show her father, Mrs. Otis cried out, "Oh dear, I'm afraid we've spilled something on the carpet. Mrs. Humphrey!" But Virginia continued to read the poem on the window, which read, "If a child will enter the secret room and stay till the dead of that night, then at last Sir Simon can sleep in his tomb, and at Canterville all will be right." "It wasn't you, madam," replied Mrs. Humphrey with a hushed voice. "Blood has been spilled there." "How horrible!" cried Mrs. Otis. "It must be removed at once." Mrs. Humphrey looked around nervously and began to speak in a low voice. "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor Canterville. She was murdered on that spot by her husband, Sir Simon Canterville, 500 years ago. 7 years later, Sir Simon Canterville disappeared. His body has never been found." Mrs. Humphrey's voice began to shake. "His spirit haunts this house. That blood stain will never go." Washington jumped down onto the carpet and scrubbed at the blood stain. Within seconds it was gone. But as he stood up, there was a crash of thunder and a terrible flash of lightning. Mrs. Humphrey fainted. The thunderstorm lasted the entire night. Rain lashed the windows and the wind howled down the chimneys. And next morning, in the very same spot on the library carpet, there was the bloodstain. Chapter 2, Clanking Chains. "There must be a simple explanation," cried Mr. Otis. That night Mr. Otis locked the library door himself and took the key to bed with him. But the blood stain still came back. After what happened the following night, Mr. Otis thought differently about ghosts. At midnight he was awoken with a strange noise outside his room. It sounded like rusty chains being dragged along the ground, and it seemed to be coming closer every second. Mr. Otis was annoyed. He put on his slippers and picked up a small bottle from his bedside table. Then he opened the door to a terrible sight. An old man with long greasy hair and ragged clothes was glaring at him out of fiery red eyes. "You must be Sir Simon," said Mr. Otis calmly. "I'm afraid, my dear sir, I must ask you to oil your chains. They make an awful noise. This bottle of oil should help." Mr. Otis left the bottle on a table and went back to bed. For a moment the Canterville Ghost was still. Then he smashed the bottle of oil onto the floor and fled down the corridor, howling. The twins heard him. As Sir Simon reached the top of the stairs, they raced out of their bedroom with a pillow. Sir Simon felt a rush of air as the pillow whizzed past his head. It very nearly hit him. The ghost quickly vanished to appear in his secret chamber in the west wing. He was furious. "I have been scaring people for hundreds of years," he grumbled, "but never have I been treated like this. How dare these newcomers give me oil for my chains and throw pillows at my head? I must get my revenge." Chapter 3. The Ghost's Revenge. "There's no need to be scared of ghosts," Mr. Otis told his family the next morning. "But you mustn't throw pillows at them. It's rude." The twins grinned. "We'll have to take those chains off him," said Mrs. Otis, "or we'll never get any sleep." But for the rest of that week, there was no sign of the ghost. The twins looked for him everywhere. They wanted to play more tricks on him. Fresh bloodstains continued to appear each morning. Strangely, each stain was a different shade. The family made guesses as to what shade it would be next. One morning, it was even a brilliant green. When she saw that, Virginia looked cross, though she couldn't say why. Meanwhile, the ghost was busy plotting his revenge. He spent days looking over his wardrobe, deciding what to wear. He planned to creep to Washington's room and make faces at the boy from the foot of his bed. Then he would stab himself in the neck 3 times to the sound of slow music. Sir Simon especially disliked Washington. It was Washington who kept removing the bloodstains. Virginia, on the other hand, had never been rude. "I shall only groan at her a few times from her wardrobe," he thought. As for the twins of course deserved the worst treatment. He'd get them. He would turn into a skeleton and crawl around their beds, staring at them from one rolling eyeball. At 10:30, the family went to bed. For a while, Sir Simon heard shrieks of laughter from the twins' room, but at last all was quiet. He crept stealthily into the corridor. An owl beat its wings against the window pane, but the Otis family slept on, peacefully unaware. Sir Simon glided along like an evil shadow, a cruel smile stretching across his wrinkled mouth. Finally, he reached the corner of the passage that led to Washington's room. He chuckled to himself, turned the corner, then let out a wail of terror. Sir Simon fell back, hiding his face in his bony white hands. Right in front of him was a horrible vision. It was bald and white, and red light streaming from its eyes. Sir Simon had never seen another ghost before. He was terrified. He fled back to his room, tripping on his own sheet as he went. Back in his chamber, he flung himself into his coffin and slammed down the lid. But as the sun rose, his bravery returned. "I shall go and talk to the ghost," he decided. "Perhaps we can deal with the twins together." By morning, the ghost looked very different. The light had gone from its eyes, and it had collapsed against the wall. Sir Simon rushed forward and seized it in his arms. To his horror, the head slipped off and rolled on the floor. He was holding a white curtain, a broom, and a large pumpkin. He had been tricked. Sir Simon ground his toothless gums together in fury, swore revenge, and stomped back to his coffin. Chapter 4. Sir Simon is upset. Sir Simon was cross and tired. The excitement of the past few days had been too much for him. For 5 days he stayed in his room. He even gave up making new bloodstains. With the twins constantly playing tricks on him, he only felt safe in his room. He knew it was his ghostly duty to appear in the corridor once a week, but he made sure he wasn't seen or heard. He even slipped into Mr. Otis's bedroom and took a bottle of oil for his chains. But he still wasn't left alone. The twins put down pins for him to tread on. One night they even stretched a piece of string across the corridor. "That's it," he decided. "I'm going to scare those twins one last time if it kills me. I'll appear as my most terrifying character, Reckless Rupert, the Headless Earl," he thought. Reckless Rupert had always worked. Sir Simon spent 2 days getting ready. Finally, he was satisfied with his appearance. As the clock struck midnight, he made his way to the twins' bedroom. He flung open the door, and a large jug of icy water tipped over him. He was shocked. Sir Simon heard muffled shrieks of laughter from the twins' beds. Furious, Sir Simon squelched back to his room. The next day he had a very bad cold. "I must give up all hope of scaring this Otis family," he said sadly. He started creeping along the passages in his slippers. One night he decided to creep to the library. He wanted to see if there was any blood left on the carpet. Suddenly, two figures jumped out at him from the darkness. "Boo! Boo!" In terror, Sir Simon ran to the stairs, but there was Washington Otis aiming a garden hose at him. Sir Simon vanished into the fireplace, which, luckily for him, wasn't lit. He arrived back in his room in a terrible state. After that, he did not leave his room at all. The Otis family started to think the ghost had left. The twins lay in wait for Sir Simon for several nights, but there was no sign of him. "I'll write a letter to Lord Canterville," said Mr. Otis. "I'm sure he'll be interested to hear that Sir Simon has gone away at last." Chapter 5. The Secret Chamber. Some weeks later, Virginia was out walking in the fields when she tore her dress climbing through a hedge. "I'll have to change," she thought, and decided to go up the back staircase so she wouldn't be seen. On the way, she noticed that the door to the tapestry room was open. "How odd," she thought. "No one ever uses a tapestry room." Virginia peered around the door. To her surprise, she saw the Canterville Ghost. Sir Simon was sitting by the window, his head in his hands. He looked so upset Virginia thought she should try and comfort him. "Cheer up," she said. "The boys are going to school tomorrow, so the tricks will stop. Besides, if you behave yourself, no one will annoy you." Sir Simon jumped up. "How can I behave myself?" he shouted. "I have to rattle my chains and groan through keyholes and walk around at night. I'm a ghost." "You don't have to do anything," said Virginia. "What's more, you've been very wicked. Mrs. Umney told us that you murdered your wife. It's wrong to kill people," she pointed out. "Yes, it was wrong," sighed Sir Simon. "But that was no reason for her brothers to starve me to death." "Oh, poor ghost," said Virginia. "I didn't know about that. Are you hungry now?" "No, thank you," he answered. "I never eat now. But it's kind of you to offer, you know," he added. "You're much nicer than the rest of your horrible family." "How dare you be rude about my family?" cried Virginia. "You're mean. You lie, and you stole all the paint out of my paint box for that blood stain. First my reds, then yellows, even the greens." "I think you should apologize," Virginia demanded. The ghost shrugged. "I don't see why I should. After all, what else could I do? Real blood is so hard to get hold of these days. And your brother would keep cleaning it up." "Fine," said Virginia. "If you won't apologize, I'm leaving." And she turned to go. "Please help me," Sir Simon called. "I'm so unhappy and so very, very tired." Now Virginia was curious. "Why are you tired?" "I haven't slept for 500 years, Sir Simon told her. Virginia gasped. "And it would be so pleasant to lie in the soft brown earth," said the ghost, "with grasses waving above my head, listening to silence." "Can't anyone help you?" asked Virginia. "You could," whispered the ghost. Virginia trembled as he spoke, and a cold shudder passed through her. "How?" she asked. "Have you ever read the poem on the library window?" "Yes, often." Virginia thought of it now. "If a child will enter the secret room and stay till the dead of night, then at last Sir Simon can sleep in his tomb, and at Canterville all will be right." "But I don't know what it means." "It means," said the ghost, "that you must come with me to my secret chamber and pray for me." "That sounds easy," said Virginia. Said Sir Simon, "but no living person has ever entered the chamber and come out alive." Virginia was terrified, but she did want to help. "I'll come with you, Sir Simon," she said bravely. "Lead the way." Sir Simon took her hand in his cold, clammy fingers. Together they walked to the end of the room, where the wall disappeared before her eyes. In a moment the wall had closed behind them, and Virginia vanished into the ghost's secret chamber. Chapter 6. Peace at last. 10 minutes later the bell rang for tea. As Virginia did not appear, Mrs. Otis sent a footman to find her. At first, Mrs. Otis thought she must be in the stables. When Virginia still hadn't returned 2 hours later, she began to panic. "Boys," she called to her sons, "go and see if you can find her." Mrs. Otis even asked Mr. Otis to drain the fish pond, but there was no sign of Virginia anywhere. At last the family sat down to supper. It was a sad meal, and hardly anyone spoke. Even the twins were quiet. As the family left the dining room, the clock in the tower began to strike midnight. On the last stroke, there was a crash and a sudden shrill cry. A panel at the top of the staircase flew back, and Virginia staggered out. Everyone rushed up to her. Mrs. Otis hugged her. Mr. Otis patted her head, and the twins danced all around them. "Where have you been?" said Mrs. Otis rather angrily. "I've been with the ghost," said Virginia quietly. "He's gone. He's been very wicked, but he was very sorry for everything he'd done. And look, he gave me this box of jewels just before he left." 4 days later they held a funeral for Sir Simon. The procession left Canterville Castle at 11 o'clock at night. The carriages were drawn by 4 black horses, each with a great tuft of ostrich feathers on its head. Lord Canterville came all the way from Wales to take part. He sat in the first carriage with Virginia. Then came Mr. and Mrs. Otis, followed by Washington and the twins. It was all wonderfully impressive. In the last carriage sat Mrs. Umley. After all, she had been frightened of the ghost for 50 years. It was only fair she should see the last of him. The next day, Mr. Otis had a word with Lord Canterville. "I think we should return the box of jewels to you. They're beautiful, especially the ruby necklace." "No, thank you, Mr. Otis," replied Lord Canterville. "The jewels were given to Virginia for being so brave, and I think she deserves them. Virginia wore the ruby necklace whenever she went to a party, but however much Washington and the twins begged, she never told anyone what happened in the secret chamber." And that's the end of the story of the Canterville Ghost. If you want to read the full version, you can find it in public domain online, or order it from a bookstore. I hope you've enjoyed this little spooky tale with a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. Enjoy your Halloween, and don't get carried away.